Deep in the heart of the Pennsylvania mountains, 18-year-old Elena Carter believed she was destined to age out of street. Catherine's orphanage, with nothing but a worn duffel bag and questions about the parents who abandoned her. She had spent her entire life within those cold institutional walls, a girl with no past and no future. Then, on the morning of her 18th birthday, a call came through the orphanage office. A dying lawyer in Philadelphia, a man named Theodore Ashford whom she had never met, was asking for her by name. His voice was weak, urgent, desperate. He had one message: she was his only living heir, and he was leaving her everything. But there was a condition. She had to come immediately to claim an inheritance that someone powerful had spent 18 years trying to keep hidden. Who was this dying stranger? What secret had he protected her entire life? And what truth was buried in the legacy he was leaving behind? Elena Carter woke on the morning of her 18th birthday to the same view she had seen every morning for as long as memory served: the water-stained ceiling of the dormitory at Street. Catherine's orphanage, the pale gray light of a Pennsylvania winter dawn struggling through windows that never seemed clean, and the sound of 24 other girls breathing in the cold silence of institutional sleep. She lay still for a moment, her thin blanket pulled to her chin, understanding with a clarity that felt like ice in her chest that this was the last birthday she would wake here, the last morning she belonged anywhere at all. In 3 days, the state would consider her an adult, and Street, Catherine's, would release her into a world she had only ever observed from behind iron gates and supervised visits to town. She had no family, no connections, and no plan beyond a duffel bag already packed beneath her bed containing everything she owned: 3 changes of clothes, a battered copy of Jane Eyre, and $63 saved from years of kitchen work. The breakfast bell rang with its usual harsh clang, and Elena moved through the morning routine with automatic precision, dressing in the orphanage's required uniform of gray skirt and white blouse, braiding her long dark hair, and filing into the dining hall with the others. She was eating her portion of watery oatmeal, trying not to think about the looming unknown, when Sister Margaret, the headmistress whose stern face had never once softened in Elena's memory, appeared in the doorway and scanned the room with her sharp, disapproving eyes. "Elena Carter," she announced, her voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "You are wanted in the office immediately." The room fell silent, every girl turning to stare. Because a summons to the office was never good news, and Elena felt her stomach twist with anxiety as she stood and followed the headmistress down the long, dim corridor, lined with fading portraits of saints. In the office, a room that smelled of old paper and furniture polish, Sister Margaret gestured to the heavy black telephone on her desk, the receiver already lifted and waiting. "There is a call for you," she said, her tone suggesting this was highly irregular and deeply suspicious. "He claims to be your attorney." Elena, who had never had an attorney or anything else that required one, took the receiver with trembling hands. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The voice that answered was weak, raspy, the voice of someone very old or very ill, each word requiring visible effort. "Elena Carter? My name is Theodore Ashford. I am an attorney in Philadelphia, and I have been your trustee since your birth. I know this must be confusing, but you must listen carefully because I do not have much time. You are my only living heir, and I am leaving you everything, but there are conditions. You must come to Philadelphia immediately. There are things you must know, things I should have told you years ago." Elena's mind reeled, unable to process the words, but before she could respond, Sister Margaret snatched the phone from her hand. "This is highly unusual," the headmistress said into the receiver. "How do I know this is legitimate?" There was a pause as she listened, her expression shifting from suspicion to surprise. "I see. Yes, it arrived this morning." She hung up and turned to Elena, pulling an envelope from her desk drawer. "A courier delivered this at dawn. It contains a bus ticket to Philadelphia departing this afternoon, and a letter of instruction on official legal letterhead. I do not know what this is about, Elena, but you are free to go. You are, after all, 18 today." The Greyhound bus pulled away from Street Catherine's orphanage at 2 in the afternoon, and Elena sat in a window seat near the back, her worn duffel bag clutched on her lap like a shield, watching the only home she had ever known disappear behind a curtain of bare winter trees. The other passengers were strangers absorbed in their own lives, and she was grateful for the anonymity, for the chance to sit in silence and try to make sense of the impossible phone call that had upended her carefully managed expectations of a future that held nothing but struggle and solitude. The bus climbed into the Pennsylvania mountains, following roads that twisted through valleys where small towns clung to the hillsides, their houses painted in faded colors, their streets empty in the cold. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the landscape roll past, the bare branches of oak and maple trees reaching toward a sky that promised snow. And somewhere in the rhythm of the journey, her mind drifted to the dream, the one that had visited her since childhood with such regularity that it felt less like a dream and more like a memory she could not quite grasp. In it, she was very small, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, and she was in a cabin made of dark logs, warm firelight dancing on the walls, and there was a woman with long dark hair like her own, singing a lullaby in a voice so full of love that even now, awake on a bus 17 years later, Elena could feel the echo of that safety, that belonging. The woman's face was always blurred, as if seen through water, but her voice was clear, and the words were always the same. "Hush now, little bird, you are safe in the nest. The mountains will keep you, the creek will sing you to rest." For years, Elena had dismissed it as nothing more than a child's fantasy, the desperate invention of an orphan's mind seeking comfort. But the dream never changed, never faded, and somewhere deep in her bones, she had always believed it was real. That once, before Street, Catherine's and the gray uniforms and the endless rules, she had been loved. The bus journey took 4 hours, descending from the mountains into the rolling farmland of eastern Pennsylvania, and finally into the outskirts of Philadelphia, where the landscape transformed into highways and industrial parks, and then, as they approached the city center, the elegant brick and stone architecture of a place that had stood since America's founding. Elena had never been to a city this large, had never seen buildings so tall or streets so crowded, and when the bus finally pulled into the terminal, she felt a wave of disorientation, a country mouse suddenly thrust into a world she did not understand. She consulted the letter Sister Margaret had given her, which contained an address written in a shaky hand, 1247 Walnut Street, 3rd floor. She asked directions from 3 different people before finding her way, walking through streets lined with naked trees and historic buildings, until she stood before a narrow brownstone wedged between a coffee shop and an antique bookstore. The building was elegant but fading, its red brick darkened by decades of city soot, its windows framed by ornate but peeling white trim. A brass plaque beside the door read Ashford and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Est. 1962. And beneath it, in smaller letters, by appointment only. Elena climbed the worn stone steps, her duffel bag heavy on her shoulder, and pushed open the heavy oak door, stepping into a dim hallway that smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and the peculiar musty scent of secrets kept too long, unaware that she was crossing a threshold that would change not just her future, but would finally, after 18 years of silence, give voice to her past. The door at the top of the narrow stairs was answered by a young man in his late 20s, Asian American with tired eyes and a rumpled suit, who introduced himself as Marcus Chen, Mr. Ashford's assistant, and the relief in his voice when he said, "Thank God you came," was so profound that Elena felt her anxiety deepen into something closer to dread. He led her down a hallway lined with filing cabinets and into a corner office where the winter light struggled through tall windows, illuminating a room that seemed frozen in time, its mahogany furniture and leather-bound law books speaking of an era long past, and there, behind a massive oak desk buried under stacks of yellowing files, sat Theodore Ashford. He was ancient, his face a landscape of deep lines and hollow cheeks, his white hair thin and wispy, his body so frail beneath his expensive but outdated 3-piece suit that he seemed almost translucent, a ghost already half departed from the world of the living. His eyes, however, were sharp and clear, a startling blue that fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her stop in the doorway, and when he spoke, his voice was the same weak rasp from the phone, each word clearly costing him. "Elena Mitchell Carter," he said, and the use of a middle name she had never known she possessed sent a shock through her system. "Sit down, child. We have very little time, and there is much I must tell you. Much I should have told you years ago." She sat in the chair across from him, her duffel bag at her feet, her hands gripped together in her lap, and Ashford reached into his desk drawer with trembling fingers, withdrawing a thick manila folder bound with string. "I have been your trustee since the day you were born," he began, his breathing labored. "Your parents, David and Sarah Mitchell, were environmental scientists, good people, brilliant people, who lived on a property in the Allegheny Mountains called Whispering Creek Estate. They were investigating something dangerous, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, and when you were 6 months old, they died in what the authorities called a car accident on a mountain road. He paused, his hand pressing against his chest, as if the words themselves caused physical pain. It was not an accident, Elena. I have always known it was not an accident, but I was a coward. They came to me 2 weeks before they died and gave me copies of their research. Evidence of crimes that could destroy corporations and end careers. And they made me promise that if anything happened to them, I would keep you safe and give you the choice they were denied. But when they died, when I saw the reach and ruthlessness of the people responsible, I hid the evidence, and I hid you. I placed you in Street Catherine's under the name Carter, your mother's maiden name, and I told myself I was protecting you, but truly, I was protecting myself. His confession hung in the air like smoke, and Elena felt tears streaming down her face. Tears for parents she could not remember, for a life stolen before it began. Ashford pushed the folder across the desk along with a brass key, a legal document that she recognized as a property deed, and a heavy metal briefcase, military grade and secured with a combination lock. The property is yours, the full 200 acres and everything on it. There is a trust fund, $50,000, enough to get you started. But the briefcase, Elena, you must promise me you will not open it until you are standing on that property, in the home your parents built. Only there will you understand what they died to protect, and only there can you decide what to do with the truth they left behind. He slumped back in his chair, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. And Marcus rushed forward, but Ashford waved him away, his blue eyes never leaving Elena's face. I am sorry, he whispered. I am so terribly sorry for the years I stole from you, for the cowardice that kept you in that place when you should have known who you were. Forgive an old fool who finally, at the very end, found the courage to do what should have been done 18 years ago. His hand reached across the desk, and Elena took it. Feeling how cold his fingers were, how weak his grip, and she held on as his breathing slowed, as his eyes closed, as Theodore Ashford, attorney at law, keeper of secrets and guardian of orphans, passed from this world with a final exhale that sounded like relief. The moments after Theodore Ashford's death passed in a blur of controlled chaos that felt surreal and distant to Elena, as if she were watching events unfold from somewhere outside her own body. Marcus Chen moved with practiced efficiency, checking for a pulse he clearly knew would not be there, then making a quiet phone call to someone he addressed as Dr. Pembroke, explaining in a voice that trembled only slightly that Mr. Ashford had passed peacefully in his office at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon. Within 20 minutes, a somber man in a black suit arrived with the paperwork that accompanies death in official Philadelphia, and Marcus guided him through the process with the weary competence of someone who had been expecting this day for months, while Elena sat frozen in her chair, the metal briefcase heavy on her lap, her mind unable to fully process that the man who had just given her back her identity had expired before her eyes. It was only after the doctor left, after the death certificate was signed, and the funeral home called, that Marcus closed the office door, turned the lock with shaking hands, and faced Elena with an expression of barely contained fear. We need to talk, and we need to talk quickly, he said, his voice low and urgent. Mr. Ashford didn't tell you everything because he didn't want to frighten you more than necessary, but I've worked for him for 3 years, and I've seen things, heard things, that you need to know before you leave this building. He moved to a filing cabinet, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and withdrew a thick accordion folder that he placed on the desk between them. This is everything related to your case, every document Mr. Ashford compiled over 18 years. The deed to Whispering Creek Estate is here, legally transferred to your name as of this morning, all 200 acres free and clear. The trust fund documents are here too, exactly $50,000 in an account at First Philadelphia Bank, accessible with the identification papers I'm giving you now. But there's something else, something Mr. Ashford wrote last night when he knew he wouldn't live much longer. Marcus pulled out a single sheet of paper, and Elena recognized immediately that it had been written by the same shaking hand that had addressed the envelope Sister Margaret gave her. But the handwriting was even more unsteady now, the letters barely legible, the words clearly written in great pain and greater urgency. She read, Elena, you must understand the danger. Meridian Chemical Corporation has wanted Whispering Creek Estate for 18 years. They believe the evidence died with your parents. Do not trust local authorities in Hartsdale County. They are compromised. Trust only federal agencies if you must involve anyone at all. The property holds the truth, but the truth has enemies who will stop at nothing. I am sorry to leave you with this burden, but it is yours by right of blood. Choose carefully. Marcus watched her read, his dark eyes wide with worry. Mr. Ashford received threatening phone calls twice in the last month, always from blocked numbers, always asking if he still represented the Mitchell estate. Someone knows he was your trustee, and if they know that, they'll soon know about you. I don't want to scare you, but I've been in this office when men in expensive suits came asking questions, claiming to represent various corporate interests, and the way they asked was not polite inquiry. It was barely veiled intimidation. He pressed the folder into her hands. You need to leave Philadelphia tonight, right now if possible. Don't go back to the orphanage. Don't talk to anyone about where you're going. Take the bus or buy a cheap car, but get to that property as quickly as you can, and when you get there, trust your instincts. Elena looked at him, this frightened young man who owed her nothing, and asked, Why are you helping me? Marcus smiled sadly. Because Mr. Ashford was the best man I ever knew, and he died with regret eating him alive. Someone should finish what he couldn't, and I think that someone is you. Elena spent the night in a modest Philadelphia hotel near the bus station, barely sleeping, the metal briefcase locked and sitting on the chair she had wedged against the door. And in the morning, she withdrew $5,000 in cash from the trust account, feeling the weight of more money than she had ever held in her life. She found a used car lot on the outskirts of the city where a skeptical salesman became considerably more cooperative when she paid in cash for a 2008 Ford pickup truck with high mileage but a solid engine. Its blue paint faded and its bed scratched, but its four-wheel drive exactly what she would need for mountain roads. She spent another $1,000 at a sporting goods store, buying supplies with the methodical focus of someone preparing for an expedition into unknown territory. A heavy sleeping bag rated for winter temperatures, a camp stove and fuel, non-perishable food, bottled water, a powerful flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, and on impulse that felt like instinct, a canister of pepper spray. By noon she was driving west out of Philadelphia, the city falling away behind her as the highway climbed into the Allegheny Mountains, and with each mile the landscape grew wilder, the towns smaller, the forests deeper, until she felt as if she were traveling not just through space but backward through time to a place the modern world had forgotten. The deed Marcus had given her listed the property as being 12 miles northeast of Hartsdale, Pennsylvania, a town so small it did not appear on her road map, and she had to stop twice at gas stations to ask directions, receiving vague gestures and suspicious looks from locals who seemed to find the presence of a young woman traveling alone through their territory unusual and unwelcome. She found Hartsdale just as the winter sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, a cluster of perhaps 24 buildings arranged along a single main street, their brick and wood facades speaking of a prosperity that had departed generations ago, leaving behind only the determined survival of people who had nowhere else to go. She parked in front of Hartsdale General Store, a weathered building with a wooden porch and windows advertising everything from groceries to hunting licenses, and when she stepped inside, a bell above the door announced her arrival to an interior that smelled of coffee, sawdust, and old wool. The man behind the counter was perhaps 60, with a weathered face and friendly eyes, and he greeted her with a smile. "Afternoon, miss. What can I do for you?" Elena approached the counter, pulling out the deed. "I'm looking for Whispering Creek Estate. The deed says it's 12 miles northeast of here, but I don't see any road markers." The moment the words left her mouth, the atmosphere in the store changed as dramatically as if she had announced she carried a plague. The owner's smile vanished, his face going carefully blank, and she became aware that the two other customers in the store, an elderly woman examining canned goods and a middle-aged man in a hunting jacket, had both frozen and were now staring at her with expressions that mixed shock with something that looked disturbingly like pity. The owner cleared his throat, his voice now cold and formal. "Whispering Creek, that's the old Mitchell place. I can't help you with that." Before Elena could respond, the elderly woman approached, her wrinkled face drawn with concern, and in a whisper that nevertheless carried in the suddenly silent store, she said, "That cursed place. The Mitchell's ghost property. No one's been up there since the accident 18 years ago. Whatever business you think you have there, child, Let it lie. The owner pointed toward the door. Road splits about 3 miles north of here. Take the eastern fork, follow it until it turns to dirt. Keep going until you can't go no further. You'll find it. His tone made it clear the conversation was over, that she was no longer welcome, and Elena left the store feeling the weight of their stares on her back. Drove north through the gathering dusk, found the fork, followed the deteriorating road into deeper wilderness, and finally, as the last light was fading from the sky, she found a gap in the trees marked by 2 rotting fence posts and a rusted chain lying in the weeds. The entrance to an overgrown trail that led into shadows and secrets, exactly as marked on the deed that said this forgotten place was now hers. The trail was barely passable, and Elena quickly understood that its deterioration was not entirely the work of nature. Someone had placed obstacles with deliberate intent, fallen logs positioned to block the path at awkward angles, a section where drainage had been redirected to create a muddy morass that tested her truck's capabilities. Thick brush growing across the track that scraped against her doors and windows as she pushed through, and twice she had to stop and use a folding shovel from her supplies to clear debris that could not be driven over. It took her nearly an hour to travel what the deed indicated was 3 miles, the headlights of her truck cutting through the gathering darkness, and she was beginning to wonder if she had taken a wrong turn when the trail suddenly opened into a small valley. And there, nestled against the mountainside beside a creek that caught the last light of day in silver ribbons, stood the cabin. Even in the dim twilight, even neglected and abandoned, it was beautiful. The structure was built of thick, dark logs, their surface weathered to a rich gray-brown, and it sat on a stone foundation that spoke of craftsmanship and permanence, a home built to last generations. A wide porch wrapped around the front, its railings sagging but intact, and the roof, steep-pitched to shed heavy mountain snow, still held its shape despite nearly 2 decades of neglect. The windows were dark and empty, like eyes that had forgotten how to see. And the creek beside the property sang its endless song to an audience of shadows and silence. Elena parked her truck, grabbed her flashlight, and approached the front door, her heart hammering with an emotion she could not name, something between grief and homecoming. The door was unlocked, swollen with moisture but yielding when she pushed, and she stepped inside, sweeping her flashlight beam across a single large room that took her breath away. It was all here, frozen in time like a museum of a life interrupted, a simple wooden table still set with 2 plates and cups, as if her parents had simply stepped away from breakfast and never returned. A comfortable sofa facing a massive stone fireplace that dominated the western wall, its river rock construction rising all the way to the exposed beam ceiling, bookshelves lined with scientific journals and field guides. And on the walls, framed photographs showing a young couple, vibrant and alive, their faces glowing with intelligence and joy. Elena moved closer to the photographs, her flashlight beam illuminating faces she had never seen but somehow knew in her bones. Her father, tall and lean with kind eyes and dark hair. Her mother, small and fierce, with the same long dark hair Elena had inherited, and in the final photo, both of them holding an infant, a tiny girl with a tuft of black hair and wide, curious eyes. She was looking at herself, at the family she had been stolen from, and the grief that crashed over her was so profound she had to sit down on the dusty sofa, her whole body shaking with sobs for a loss she had carried all her life without understanding its source. When she could breathe again, she stood and continued her exploration, finding a small kitchen area, a bedroom with a bed still made with faded quilts, and most heartbreakingly, on the wall beside the fireplace, at exactly the height a toddler could reach, a series of crude crayon drawings, stick figures in a house, a sun, a dog, the innocent scribbles of a child who had lived here, who had been loved here, who had been Elena herself before the world took it all away. She ran her fingers over the drawings, over the waxy residue of crayons wielded by hands too small to remember wielding them, and she understood with absolute certainty that the dream was not a dream at all, but a memory, that the woman singing the lullaby was her mother, that this cabin with its massive stone hearth and the sound of the creek outside was the nest the song had promised, and she had finally, after 18 years of exile, come home. Elena spent her first night in the cabin wrapped in her new sleeping bag on the dusty sofa, too emotionally exhausted to do more than eat a protein bar and drink water before sleep claimed her. And she woke to pale morning light streaming through the grimy windows and the sound of barking, persistent and urgent, coming from somewhere outside. She pulled on her jacket and boots and followed the sound to a weathered barn she had not noticed in the darkness. Its red paint faded to the color of rust, its doors hanging slightly ajar, and as she approached, the barking intensified, accompanied now by a voice, elderly and female, speaking in soothing tones. Elena pushed the door open to find a woman who must have been in her 70s, small and wiry with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing mud-stained jeans and a thick canvas coat, kneeling beside a large German shepherd who was eating from a metal bowl. The woman looked up at Elena's entrance, her weathered face registering shock, then something that looked like recognition, and then, unexpectedly, tears. "Sweet, merciful heaven," she whispered. "You look just like her. You're Sarah's girl, aren't you? You're Elena." The dog, having finished eating, turned his attention to Elena, and she saw that his coat was a beautiful mix of black and silver, the distinctive coloring that made him look like a shadow given form, and though his muzzle was graying and his movements carried the careful deliberation of age, his eyes were bright and intelligent. He approached her slowly, his tail held low, not wagging but trembling slightly, and when he reached her, he sat and looked up at her face with an intensity that seemed almost human, letting out a soft, plaintive whine that sounded like a question asked across years of waiting. Elena knelt and extended her hand, and the dog leaned forward, pressing his nose into her palm, breathing in her scent, and then, as if some recognition passed between them, some acknowledgement of shared loss and shared blood, he moved closer and rested his great head against her shoulder. "His name is Scholar," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your parents got him as a puppy just a few months before they died. He was Sarah's shadow, followed her everywhere, and after the accident, I couldn't bear to let them take him to a shelter. I'm Ruth Pemberton. I live about 5 miles down the valley, and Sarah Mitchell was my dearest friend." She stood slowly, arthritis evident in her movements. "I've been coming here twice a week for 9 years, ever since Scholar got too old to make the walk to my place on his own. Before that, he'd show up at my door every few days, like he was checking to make sure I hadn't forgotten, and then he'd come back here to wait. He's been waiting for you, I think, though I didn't know if you'd ever come." Elena looked up at her, still kneeling with the dog pressed against her. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Why didn't you come forward?" Ruth's face hardened. "Come forward to who? The sheriff who ruled your parents' death an accident without a proper investigation? The county officials who were so eager to declare this property abandoned? I knew what happened to Sarah and David, and I knew I couldn't prove it, and I knew that speaking up would only get me killed too. So I stayed quiet, and I kept Scholar alive, and I hoped that someday, somehow, the truth would find its way home." She moved toward the barn door, then turned back. "You need to leave this place, Elena. Pack up and go tonight. The same people who killed your parents are still here, still powerful, and they will not let you stay." Elena stood, Scholar rising with her, his body pressed against her leg. "I'm not leaving. This is my home." Ruth studied her for a long moment, seeing in the set of the girl's jaw and the determination in her eyes an echo of the friend she had lost. "You're Sarah's daughter, all right, stubborn as mountain stone. Then I suppose I'd better help you, because you're going to need all the allies you can get." Elena's second night at the cabin was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel and the sweep of headlights across the windows, and she sat up from the sofa where she had been reading through her mother's old journals by lantern light. Scholar immediately on his feet beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. She moved to the window and saw a white SUV with the green and gold insignia of the Hartsdale County Sheriff's Department painted on its side, and a man in uniform was climbing out, his hand resting on the weapon at his belt in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. Elena stepped onto the porch, Scholar at her side, as the deputy approached, his flashlight beam sweeping across her face in a way that felt deliberately aggressive. He was perhaps 40, with a thick neck and small eyes, and his smile was not friendly. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who enjoyed his authority. "I'm Deputy Frank Cutler. We received a complaint about trespassing on the old Mitchell property. You want to tell me what you're doing here?" Elena kept her voice steady, despite the fear climbing her spine. "I'm not trespassing. I'm the legal owner. My name is Elena Carter, and I inherited this property from my parents, David and Sarah Mitchell." She had anticipated this moment, and had kept the deed in her jacket pocket, and she pulled it out now, unfolding the official document with its county seal and legal descriptions. Deputy Cutler took the deed, barely glancing at it before handing it back with a dismissive snort. "This doesn't look right to me. Property's been abandoned for near 2 decades, and suddenly you show up with a piece of paper? I think there's been some kind of fraud here, and until the county can investigate the legitimacy of your claim, you need to vacate the premises." His tone made it clear this was not a suggestion but a threat. Elena felt anger replace her fear. "This deed was filed with the Philadelphia County Court and transferred to me legally. You have no authority to make me leave my own property." Cutler's face darkened, and he took a step closer, using his size to loom over her. "Little girl, I got all the authority I need. This is Hartsdale County, and we don't take kindly to outsiders coming in with questionable documents trying to claim land. Now you can leave peaceful like tonight, or I can come back tomorrow with a court order and make things a whole lot more difficult for you." Scholar's growl intensified, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth, and Cutler's hand moved to his weapon. "That dog threatening an officer?" Elena placed a hand on Scholar's head. "He's just protective. We're not leaving, Deputy. If you want to investigate the deed, you're welcome to contact the Philadelphia attorney who filed it. But until you have an actual legal order, I'm staying on my property." Cutler stared at her for a long moment, clearly unused to being challenged, and then he smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Have it your way, but don't say I didn't warn you." He walked back to his SUV, and Elena watched from the porch as he sat in the driver's seat, and even from a distance, she could see the glow of his phone screen as he made a call, speaking to someone for several minutes, gesturing as he talked. When he finally drove away, his taillights disappearing down the overgrown trail, Scholar moved to the exact spot where Cutler had stood and growled at the ground, his hackles raised, as if the deputy had left behind some invisible contamination. Elena stood in the darkness, watching the space where his vehicle had been, and she understood with cold clarity that the call he had made was a report to someone, and that the first move in a larger game had just been played. The change in Scholar's behavior began subtly on the 3rd morning, and at first Elena attributed it to the stress of adapting to a new person after years of solitary waiting, but by the afternoon it had escalated into something that filled her with a growing unease she could not name. The dog, who had been eating well and following her around the property with evident contentment, suddenly lost all interest in food, ignoring the kibble Ruth had left and even turning away from the pieces of dried meat Elena offered from her own supplies. Instead, he spent hours sitting in front of the massive stone fireplace, staring at its river rock face with an intensity that seemed almost trance-like, occasionally rising to sniff along the base where the stones met the wooden floor, his nose working frantically as if following a scent only he could detect. Elena tried to coax him away, calling his name, patting her leg, even going outside to see if he would follow, but Scholar would only glance at her with what looked disturbingly like frustration before returning his attention to the hearth. By evening, his behavior had intensified to the point where he began pawing at one particular stone on the left side of the fireplace base, a large flat slab of slate that was slightly darker than the surrounding river rocks, his claws scraping against the surface with a sound that set Elena's teeth on edge. She knelt beside him, running her hands over the stone, feeling nothing unusual, seeing nothing that would explain his obsession. "What is it, boy? What do you sense there?" she asked, and Scholar looked at her with his intelligent amber eyes and let out a low, plaintive whine, then deliberately pawed at the stone again, harder this time, as if trying to communicate something vital that she was too dense to understand. She tried to distract him with a walk, and he followed reluctantly, but the moment they returned to the cabin, he went straight back to the hearth, and this time he began to dig at the base with both front paws, his breathing heavy and urgent, small sounds of distress coming from his throat. Elena's initial interpretation had been that this was grief, that the fireplace held some association with her parents, and Scholar was trying to reach them through the only portal he understood. But as she watched him work at the stone with single-minded determination, she remembered Theodore Ashford's dying words, his insistence that she not open the metal briefcase until she was standing on this property, his promise that only here would she understand what her parents had died to protect. She looked at the briefcase, which she had placed on the mantel above the very hearth Scholar was obsessed with, and then back at the dog, who had now worn his paws raw enough that she could see traces of blood on the stone. "Stop, Scholar, stop," she said firmly, pulling him back gently, and he obeyed but immediately turned to her and barked, a sharp, commanding sound he had not made before. then looked pointedly at the stone, then back at her, his message unmistakable. Look here, search here, this matters. Elena knelt again, this time with purpose, and began to examine the slate slab more carefully, running her fingers along its edges where it met the surrounding stones, and that was when she felt it. A barely perceptible gap, a line of separation so fine it was almost invisible, and when she pressed down on one corner, she felt the slightest give, a movement that should not exist in a solid hearth. Her heart began to pound as she stood and retrieved a crowbar from the tools Ruth had left in the barn, and Scholar, sensing that she finally understood, sat back and watched with what could only be described as satisfaction, as Elena wedged the flat end into the gap and began to pry at the stone that held her parents' deepest secrets. The stone resisted at first, its seal having settled and hardened over 18 years of stillness, but Elena put her full weight against the crowbar, her muscles straining, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cabin's chill, and with a sound like a groan of reluctant surrender, the massive slate slab shifted, rising on one edge to reveal not solid foundation beneath but darkness, an opening, a deliberate void in the structure that should not exist. Scholar let out a soft bark of encouragement, his tail wagging now, his entire body vibrating with excitement as Elena worked the crowbar around the perimeter, breaking the seal completely. And with a final effort that left her gasping, she slid the heavy stone aside, revealing a rectangular opening approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, and when she shone her flashlight into the space below, she saw not earth but wooden steps descending into what appeared to be a small underground room. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed the lantern from the table, lit it, and carefully descended the steep stairs, Scholar's nose pressed against her leg, both of them moving into the hidden chamber that her parents had constructed with such care and such secrecy. The room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, its walls lined with the same river rock as the fireplace above, creating a naturally cool and dry environment, and as Elena raised the lantern, its light revealed a space that was not a cellar or a storage room, but a compact, meticulously organized laboratory. Along one wall stood a workbench supporting an array of scientific equipment that Elena, even with her limited knowledge, recognized as water testing apparatus, spectrophotometers in protective cases, pH meters, microscopes, centrifuges, and racks of glass vials and test tubes, all covered with dust but perfectly preserved in the stable underground environment. The opposite wall held floor-to-ceiling shelving, and on these shelves, arranged with obsessive precision, were hundreds of small glass jars, each one sealed with a rubber stopper and labeled in her mother's neat handwriting with a date, a time, and a set of coordinates. Elena picked up one jar at random, reading the label, Sample 47B, Whispering Creek, Upstream Junction, the 15th of June 2003, 14:30 hours, and inside was a quantity of water, still clear after all these years, waiting to tell its story. Beside the water samples were canvas bags containing soil, each similarly labeled, and on the wall above the shelves, her father had mounted 3 large topographical maps of the surrounding region, their surfaces marked with hundreds of colored pins and handwritten notations, dates ranging from 1998 to 2006, and as Elena studied them, she could see a pattern emerging. The pins grew denser and the notations more urgent as the years progressed, clustering around creek beds, springs, and watersheds, each one marked with numbers she assumed represented contamination levels, and the numbers were increasing, a silent alarm recorded in ink and data. On the workbench, sealed in 3 heavy-duty waterproof cases of the kind used by professional photographers, were hard drives, their labels indicating they were backups of master files, dated and organized by year, the digital repository of everything her parents had discovered. Elena stood in the center of this hidden room, this shrine to scientific integrity and desperate investigation, and she understood that her parents had not just been studying the environment as academics or hobbyists, but had been documenting a crime, building a case with the methodical precision of prosecutors preparing for trial, and they had hidden this evidence here, beneath their own hearth, beneath the literal foundation of their home, because they knew that someone would come looking for it, and they knew that their daughter, if she ever returned, would need this truth to understand why they had died and what they had died defending. Elena climbed back up from the hidden laboratory, Scholar at her heels, and retrieved the metal briefcase from the mantel, her fingers trembling as she fit the brass key. Theodore Ashford had given her into the combination lock, turning it until she heard the mechanism click and release. And when she lifted the lid, she found herself staring at the culmination of her parents' work, the evidence they had compiled, knowing it might cost them everything. The briefcase was organized with the same meticulous precision as the laboratory below, its contents protected in sealed plastic sleeves, and on top was a bound report, professionally formatted with a title page that read, "Comprehensive Analysis of Chemical Contamination in the Upper Allegheny Watershed. Evidence of Systematic Industrial Pollution by Meridian Chemical Corporation. 1995 to 2006. Principal investigators, Dr. David Mitchell and Dr. Sarah Mitchell." Elena carried the report to the table, lit every lantern she had, and began to read, and with each page, her horror and her understanding deepened. Her parents had not stumbled upon this contamination by accident. They had been tracking it systematically, beginning in 1998 when Sarah, who had been pregnant with Elena at the time, noticed an unusual number of obituaries in the local newspaper for a town called Millersport, 15 miles downstream, all listing cancer as the cause of death, the victims disproportionately young. What had started as curiosity became investigation, and investigation became crusade as they discovered that Millersport, along with 2 other small towns in the watershed, had cancer rates nearly 3 times the national average, a statistical anomaly so stark it screamed for explanation. The report detailed how David and Sarah had spent 8 years collecting water and soil samples from dozens of locations, testing them in their hidden laboratory, and documenting the presence of industrial toxins, trichloroethylene, benzene, heavy metals including arsenic and lead, and a cocktail of organic compounds that should never exist in a mountain watershed. They had traced the contamination upstream, following its source like detectives following a trail of blood, and the trail led directly to the Meridian Chemical Corporation's manufacturing facility, a sprawling complex built in 1994 on the banks of Copper Run Creek, which fed directly into the main watershed. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Internal Meridian documents, obtained through a whistleblower whose name was redacted for protection, showed that the company had known about leaks in their waste containment system as early as 1996, had chosen not to repair them because the cost would impact quarterly profits, and had instead implemented a policy of midnight dumping, releasing untreated chemical waste directly into Copper Run Creek during hours when monitoring was minimal. The documents included emails between executives discussing the acceptable risk of environmental violations versus the cost of proper disposal, memos instructing plant managers to falsify inspection reports, and most chillingly, a risk assessment that calculated it would be cheaper to pay potential future lawsuits than to upgrade their waste management systems. The report included photographs, testimonials from residents of the affected towns describing their losses, and statistical models showing the direct correlation between proximity to the contaminated watershed and cancer incidents. The final page of the report was a draft of a letter addressed to the Environmental Protection Agency, dated the 12th of April 2006, 2 days before the car accident that killed David and Sarah Mitchell. And it began, "We are writing to report systematic environmental crimes of the highest magnitude and to request immediate federal intervention and investigation of Meridian Chemical Corporation. Lives are being lost, and the contamination continues. We have documented evidence and are prepared to testify." The letter was unsigned, never sent, and Elena understood with absolute clarity that her parents had been murdered not randomly but strategically, eliminated precisely because they had been about to expose a crime that would have destroyed a corporation and sent executives to prison, and the briefcase she now held contained the weapon they had died trying to deploy. Elena was carefully returning the documents to the briefcase when a photograph slipped from between 2 pages and fell onto the table, and she picked it up to find herself looking at an image that must have been taken shortly after her birth, showing her mother Sarah holding an infant Elena while her father David stood beside them with his arm around Sarah's shoulders, all 3 of them smiling with the uncomplicated joy of new parents. But they were not alone in the photograph. Standing beside David was another couple, a tall man with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and a petite woman with red hair and a warm smile, and the 4 adults were clearly close friends. Their body language speaking of familiarity and trust, gathered together to celebrate the arrival of a child. Elena was studying the photograph, wondering who these people were, when Ruth arrived with Scholar's morning food, and the moment the older woman saw the image, her face went pale, and she sat down heavily in one of the chairs, her hand pressed to her chest. "That's Daniel and Rebecca Harmon," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't seen this photograph in 18 years. Didn't know Sarah had made a copy. They were your parents' research partners, environmental scientists like David and Sarah, and the four of them worked together on the watershed contamination study. Daniel had a doctorate in toxicology, and Rebecca specialized in statistical epidemiology, and they were the ones who helped your parents understand the scope of what Meridian was doing, who helped compile the medical data from the affected towns." Elena felt her stomach clench with a premonition she did not want to confirm. What happened to them? Ruth looked at her with eyes that had seen too much loss. "Daniel Harmon died of a heart attack on the 20th of April 2006, exactly 1 week after your parents' car accident. He was 34 years old, perfectly healthy, an athlete who ran marathons, and one morning he just collapsed in his kitchen while making coffee. The medical examiner ruled it natural causes, said sometimes these things happen without warning. But I was at his funeral, and I saw Rebecca's face, and she knew it wasn't natural. She knew they had killed him just like they killed David and Sarah." She paused, wiping at her eyes. Rebecca disappeared 3 days after Daniel's funeral. Her house was found empty, her car was gone, and the official story was that she had fled in grief, couldn't bear to stay in a place that held so many memories. But I've always wondered if she ran because she knew she was next, or if they took her and just made it look like she left. Elena stared at the photograph, at these 4 young idealistic scientists who had discovered a terrible truth and had paid for it with their lives, and the full magnitude of what she was facing crashed over her like a wave of ice water. This was not just about her parents anymore. This was about a pattern of systematic elimination, a conspiracy that had murdered at least 3 people and possibly 4, that had operated for 18 years with impunity, that had the power to make deaths look like accidents and disappearances look like voluntary flight, and that had corrupted enough local officials to ensure no real investigation ever took place. The evidence in the briefcase she held was not just damaging to Meridian Chemical Corporation. It was evidence of crimes that included murder. And the people who had committed those murders were still here, still powerful, still watching, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who threatened to expose them. "We need to find Rebecca Harmon," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "If she's alive, she's a witness, and she might have evidence of her own. We need to find her before they do." The black Cadillac Escalade appeared on the 5th day of Elena's occupation of Whispering Creek Estate, navigating the deliberately obstructed trail with an ease that suggested either professional driving or prior knowledge of the route, and when it pulled to a stop in front of the cabin, the man who emerged was so perfectly composed, so immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit that must have cost more than Elena's truck, that he seemed almost absurdly out of place against the backdrop of mountain wilderness and weathered logs. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair styled with precision, a face that was handsome in a corporate catalog way, and a smile that showed expensive dental work as he approached the porch where Elena stood, with Scholar growling softly at her side. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, extending a hand in greeting. "My name is Victor Crane, Executive Vice President of Community Relations for Meridian Chemical Corporation. I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to introduce myself and discuss a proposal that I think you'll find very interesting." Elena did not take his hand, and after a moment he withdrew it without apparent offense, his smile never wavering. "I understand you've recently inherited this beautiful property, and I want to begin by offering my sincere condolences for the loss of your parents. David and Sarah Mitchell were dedicated environmental scientists, and their tragic accident was a loss to the entire scientific community." The practiced sympathy in his voice made Elena's skin crawl, but she kept her expression neutral. "What can I do for you, Mr. Crane?" He gestured to the landscape around them. "Meridian has been a part of this community for over 30 years, and we take our corporate responsibility very seriously. We've been looking for an appropriate way to honor the environmental legacy of researchers like your parents, and when we learned that their daughter had inherited Whispering Creek Estate, we saw an opportunity to create something meaningful. We would like to purchase this property from you for $500,000 cash, with the intention of establishing the Mitchell Memorial Nature Preserve, a protected wilderness area dedicated to environmental education and conservation research. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, filled with glossy architectural renderings showing trails and educational centers. You would be doing tremendous good while securing your own financial future. $500,000 is a life-changing sum for someone your age. Elena looked at the renderings, at the carefully designed propaganda, and felt a cold anger building in her chest. The property isn't for sale. Crane's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Miss Carter, I understand this is your family home, and there's sentimental value, but you need to be practical. You're 18 years old, you have no resources, and maintaining a property like this is expensive and complicated. We're offering you a generous price and the chance to honor your parents' memory. I would encourage you to think very carefully before refusing. She met his eyes, seeing the calculation behind the charm. I said no. The smile vanished entirely now, replaced by an expression of cold appraisal. That's unfortunate. You should know that there have been some questions raised about the legitimacy of your inheritance, irregularities in the title transfer that the county is obligated to investigate. There are also concerns about code violations on the property, environmental regulations that may not have been followed, issues that could result in substantial fines or even condemnation. It would be terrible if you found yourself embroiled in expensive legal battles, especially when you have such a simple alternative. The threat was delivered in the same smooth, cultured voice, but its meaning was unmistakable, and Scholar's growl intensified, the dog sensing the menace beneath the polished exterior. Elena stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. Get off my property, Mr. Crane, and tell whoever sent you that I'm not going anywhere. Crane studied her for a long moment, then smiled again, but this time there was nothing warm in it, only a cold promise. You're making a serious mistake, Miss Carter. I'll be in touch. He returned to his vehicle and drove away, leaving Elena standing on her porch, Scholar pressed against her leg, and she understood that the gloves were off, that Meridian now knew she had found the evidence, and that the war her parents had died fighting had just entered its next, more dangerous phase. That evening, Ruth returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, and she found Elena sitting on the porch steps, the briefcase open beside her, surrounded by documents she had been organizing, and the older woman sat down heavily beside her without invitation, her weathered hands clasped together, and began to speak in a voice heavy with 18 years of suppressed grief and guilt. I need to tell you everything, child. Everything I should have told the authorities back then, but was too frightened to say, too cowardly to risk my own safety for the truth. Sarah Mitchell was my closest friend, the sister I never had by blood but chose by love, and we met when she and David first moved here in 1997, two young scientists full of idealism and hope, wanting to live close to the land they studied. We became inseparable, and when she got pregnant with you, I was the first person she told, and I was there in this cabin the day you were born, holding her hand through the labor because the nearest hospital was 2 hours away and you were in a hurry to meet the world. Ruth's voice cracked, but she pressed on. In the months before they died, Sarah changed. She became frightened, watchful, constantly looking over her shoulder, and she told me things in whispers when David wasn't listening because she didn't want to worry him more than he already was. She said they were being followed, that a black car had been parking on the road near their observation sites, that their phone line made strange clicking sounds, that someone had broken into their truck while it was parked in town and gone through their papers but taken nothing. She knew they were being watched, and she knew it was because of what they had discovered about Meridian. 3 weeks before the accident, she came to my house in the middle of the night, and she had you in her arms, just 6 months old, and she was crying, and she said, Ruth, if anything happens to us, someone will come for Elena one day, someone good, someone who wants to know the truth. You have to help them. Promise me. I promised, not really believing anything would happen, telling myself she was being paranoid, that even corporations as ruthless as Meridian wouldn't commit murder. And then 2 weeks later, she and David were dead, their car found at the bottom of a ravine on a road they had driven 1,000 times. And the sheriff ruled it an accident without even questioning why 2 experienced mountain drivers would suddenly lose control on a clear day. Ruth wiped tears from her lined face. I was a coward, Elena. I knew it wasn't an accident. I knew Daniel Harmon's heart attack a week later wasn't natural. I knew Rebecca Harmon didn't just disappear out of grief, but I was terrified. And I had my own daughter to think about. And I told myself that speaking up would accomplish nothing except getting me killed too. So I stayed silent, but I kept my promise to Sarah in the only ways I could. I took Scholar before they could send him to a shelter, and I've kept him alive all these years, and I've maintained this property from a distance, paying the property taxes anonymously, keeping the trail barely passable, spreading rumors that it was cursed to keep people away, waiting for the day someone would come asking questions, waiting for you. She turned to look at Elena directly, her eyes red and glistening. I've carried the guilt of my silence for 18 years, carried it like a stone in my chest, and I can't undo my cowardice, but I can help you now. Whatever you need, whatever you decide to do with that evidence, I'm with you, and I won't run this time. Elena had driven into Hartsdale that afternoon to buy supplies and use the library's internet to research Rebecca Harmon, leaving Scholar with Ruth, who had promised to keep him safe. And when she returned to Whispering Creek Estate as dusk was falling, she knew immediately that something was wrong, because the front door, which she had locked with the new deadbolt she'd installed just 2 days prior, stood slightly ajar, and the quality of silence emanating from the cabin felt violated and hostile. She approached cautiously, her hand gripping the pepper spray in her pocket, and pushed the door open to find a scene that made her blood run cold, not because of obvious destruction, but because of its calculated precision. The cabin had been searched by professionals who understood the value of discretion. Nothing was overturned or smashed in the dramatic way of common burglars, but everything had been moved, examined, and replaced almost but not quite in its original position. And Elena, who had developed an intimate knowledge of her parents' home, could see the subtle wrongness everywhere. Books on shelves pulled forward by millimeters, drawers closed but not quite flush. The sofa cushions rotated so their faded sides faced different directions, cabinets opened and carefully shut, and most chillingly, her own belongings rifled through with surgical precision, her duffel bag's contents examined and repacked in an order she had not used. She moved through the cabin in a state of controlled panic, checking for what might be missing, but her laptop was still there, her small amount of cash untouched, and the briefcase, which she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard under the bed, remained in its hiding place with all documents intact, which meant whoever had searched the cabin had either not found it, or had found it and photographed its contents without taking the originals. The worst discovery came when she descended into the hidden laboratory, and she found the stone slab that concealed its entrance had been moved aside and left conspicuously open, a message that they knew. They had found her parents' secret workspace, and the careful way the laboratory had been searched, every jar examined, every hard drive noted but left in place, told her that they were not trying to destroy evidence, but rather cataloging exactly what evidence existed and where. Scholar, whom Ruth had released when she saw Elena's truck return, came bounding into the cabin and immediately began a frantic inspection of the entire space, his nose working overtime, his body tense with agitation, and he marked specific spots with low growls, the places where the intruders had stood, had touched, had violated their sanctuary. Elena called Ruth, who arrived within 20 minutes, her face going pale when she saw the evidence of the intrusion, and together they checked every inch of the property, finding no signs of forced entry because whoever had done this possessed lock-picking skills that rendered her new deadbolt meaningless. That night, Elena barely slept, sitting in the darkness with Scholar pressed against her side and the pepper spray in one hand, listening to every sound the old cabin made, every creak and groan, wondering if they would return. And when dawn finally came, she decided she needed to drive back to town to call Marcus Chen and report what had happened. She was walking toward her truck, keys in hand, when Scholar suddenly planted himself in front of her and refused to move, barking sharply, and when she tried to step around him, he grabbed her jacket with his teeth and pulled her back toward the cabin, and something in his urgency made her stop and really look at the truck. And that was when she noticed the small puddle of clear fluid beneath the rear end, and when she crawled underneath on her back and looked up at the brake lines, she saw the clean, deliberate cut. A slice made with a sharp blade that would have left her with no braking ability the moment she started down the mountain road, and she lay there in the dirt, staring at the evidence of attempted murder, understanding that whoever had searched her cabin had also tried to kill her, and that Scholar, her parents' dog, her faithful guardian, had just saved her life. After discovering the cut brake lines, Elena spent the day securing the cabin as best she could, installing motion sensor lights Ruth brought from town, and moving her truck to a position where she could see it from the window. And it was during this process of fortification that she found, tucked into a drawer of her mother's desk that she had somehow overlooked in her previous searches, a slim, leather-bound journal with Sarah Mitchell's name embossed in gold on the cover. And when she opened it and saw the familiar handwriting from the laboratory labels, she had to sit down because she was holding her mother's private thoughts, her fears and hopes recorded in her own hand. The journal began in January 2006, and the early entries were scientific in nature, documenting contamination levels and research findings. But as the weeks progressed, the tone shifted, becoming more personal, more frightened, and Elena read with tears streaming down her face as her mother wrote, February 3, 2006. David doesn't know I'm keeping this separate record, but I need to write down what's happening because I'm scared, and I need to believe that if something happens to us, someone will find this and understand. We've been followed 3 times this week. A black sedan with tinted windows that parks at the end of whatever road we're working on. David says I'm being paranoid, but I know surveillance when I see it. They know what we've found. The entries grew more anguished. The 15th of March 2006. Elena smiled at me today, a real smile, not gas. And I held her and cried because what kind of mother am I, putting my 6-month-old daughter in danger for the sake of environmental justice? But then I think about the children in Millersport dying of leukemia, about the mothers there who have already lost what I'm terrified of losing, and I know I can't stop. We can't stop. This evidence has to reach the EPA, has to be made public, because if we stay silent, we're complicit in murder. There were entries describing threatening phone calls, a break-in at their truck, and most chilling, a conversation with Daniel Harmon where he told Sarah he'd been approached by a Meridian representative who offered him money to reconsider his findings. The 5th of April, 2006, I did something today that David would be furious about if he knew. I made copies of everything, all the hard drives, all the reports, all the internal Meridian documents we obtained, and I packaged them up and sent them to Theodore Ashford in Philadelphia. He was David's mentor in graduate school, a good man, an honest lawyer, and I wrote him a letter explaining everything and asking him to keep the evidence safe. I also asked him, if anything happens to us, to take Elena and hide her, keep her away from all of this until she's old enough to decide for herself what to do with her parents' legacy. I'm not being paranoid. I know something is going to happen. I can feel it. The final entry was dated the 13th of April, 2006, written in handwriting that was shakier than the previous entries, and it read, Tomorrow, we're meeting with Rebecca and Daniel to finalize the EPA letter, and then we mail it. I should be relieved that we're finally taking action, but I'm terrified. Our phone rang at 3 a.m. last night, and when David answered, no one spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end. This morning I found our mail scattered on the ground, like someone had been through it. I'm writing this while sitting in Elena's room, watching her sleep. She's so beautiful, so perfect, and she has no idea that her mother is about to do something that might take me away from her forever. If I die, if we both die, I hope she finds this someday. I hope she knows that we loved her more than anything, and that we died trying to make the world safer for her and for all the children who deserve clean water and honest government. I'm so scared, but I'm also ready. Tomorrow, we send the letter. Elena closed the journal, pressed it to her chest, and wept for the mother who had known death was coming and had chosen truth anyway. Elena was still sitting with her mother's journal when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching, and she immediately grabbed the pepper spray and moved to the window, Scholar at her side, growling. But when she saw the modest Honda sedan navigating the trail, she recognized it as Marcus Chen's car from Philadelphia, and she rushed outside to meet him as he climbed out, looking exhausted and nervous. His suit replaced by jeans and a sweatshirt, his normally neat hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it during the entire 8-hour drive. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" she asked, and he pulled a briefcase from his back seat, not the military-grade case Ashford had given her but a lawyer's leather briefcase, and his hands were shaking as he held it. "I found something while settling Mr. Ashford's estate, something he left specific instructions about, and I couldn't trust it to mail or phone or any communication that could be intercepted. I quit my job, Elena. I walked out 3 days ago because I couldn't keep working in that office knowing what I know, seeing the files I've seen, and pretending everything was normal." He opened the briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope, thick and official, with Elena's name written on the front in Ashford's careful script, and beneath her name was a note in the same hand. To be delivered to Elena Mitchell Carter only if she remains at Whispering Creek Estate for a minimum of 2 weeks. If she leaves before then, destroy unopened. Marcus handed it to her with trembling fingers. "You've been here almost 2 weeks now. This is yours." Elena tore open the envelope, and inside were 3 pages of densely written text, Ashford's final testament, and she read aloud so Marcus could hear. "Elena, if you are reading this, then you have done what I could not. You have stayed, you have claimed your inheritance, and you have chosen to face the truth rather than run from it. I need to make a confession that has eaten at my soul for 18 years. When your mother sent me the evidence of Meridian's crimes, when she asked me to protect you if anything happened, I promised I would do both, report the crimes, and keep you safe. But when David and Sarah died, when I saw how easily Meridian made their murder look like an accident, when Daniel Harmon dropped dead a week later and Rebecca Harmon vanished, I became paralyzed with fear. I took the evidence your mother died to expose, and I buried it in a filing cabinet. I took you, a 6-month-old orphan, and I hid you in the bleakest institution I could find, telling myself I was protecting you from Meridian's reach. But the truth is I was protecting myself from the responsibility of doing what was right. For 18 years, I have been a coward and a betrayer of everything your parents stood for. My terminal diagnosis was, perversely, a gift. It freed me from fear because I was dying anyway, and it gave me the courage I should have had all along to finally give you the choice your parents died defending. To fight or to walk away. I pray you can forgive me, and I pray you are stronger than I was." Elena's hands shook as she finished reading, and Marcus spoke quietly. "There's more you should know. Before I left Philadelphia, I copied everything, every file Ashford kept on your parents' case, every document related to Meridian, 18 years of correspondence and evidence. It's all on this hard drive." He pulled a small external drive from his pocket. "I'm here to help you finish what they started, if you'll have me." The escalation began the morning after Marcus's arrival, when a convoy of 3 county vehicles appeared on the trail, disgorging a small army of inspectors wearing official badges and carrying clipboards. And for the next 6 hours, they crawled over every inch of Whispering Creek Estate, citing Elena for violations that ranged from the absurd to the impossible. The cabin's foundation was allegedly not up to code, despite having stood for over a century. The well water was declared potentially contaminated and requiring expensive testing despite Elena having sent samples to an independent lab that found it pristine. The septic system was deemed inadequate. The electrical wiring was labeled a fire hazard, and most insulting, they cited her for operating an unlicensed laboratory after discovering the hidden room beneath the hearth, slapping her with fines totaling over $50,000 and threatening condemnation if she didn't comply with their invented requirements within 30 days. The phone calls started that same night, the cabin's old landline ringing at odd hours, 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and when Elena answered, there would be only breathing. Or sometimes a distorted voice that whispered things like, "You should have taken the money," and accidents happen to stubborn girls before disconnecting, and after the 5th call she stopped answering. But the phone kept ringing, a psychological assault designed to prevent sleep and erode sanity. Her truck was vandalized 3 nights running. First with slashed tires, then with sugar poured into the gas tank, and finally with every window smashed, the repairs costing money she could barely afford and leaving her increasingly isolated on the property with no reliable means of escape. The shooting happened on a cold morning when Scholar was outside doing his usual patrol of the property line, and Elena heard the crack of a rifle shot echo across the valley, followed by Scholar's terrified yelp, and she ran outside to find the dog racing back to the cabin, unharmed, but with a bullet hole in the tree directly behind where he had been standing. A miss of perhaps 6 inches that could only have been deliberate, a warning that said we could have killed your dog but chose not to, this time. Ruth's house, 5 miles down the valley, was broken into the following night while she was staying at the cabin to help Elena, and when they drove there the next morning, they found systematic destruction. Furniture overturned, family photographs smashed, drawers emptied and their contents scattered, and most ominously, a message spray-painted across her living room wall in red letters 3 feet high that read, "Keep your mouth shut next time you're home." The older woman stood in the ruins of her home and wept, not from fear but from rage, and she told Elena that she had lived in that house for 40 years, had raised her daughter there, had thought herself too old and too insignificant to be worth threatening, and the violation of her sanctuary made her more determined than ever to see Meridian destroyed. Marcus, who had been staying in a motel in Hartsdale, reported that his room was searched while he was out, his rental car followed by unmarked vehicles, and that the motel manager had suggested it might be better if he found accommodation elsewhere, the threat barely concealed beneath a veneer of polite concern. The message from all of this orchestrated harassment was crystal clear. Elena was surrounded, outmatched, and facing an enemy with unlimited resources and no compunction about escalating to violence. And her choices were to surrender the property and flee, or to stay and face consequences that grew darker with each passing day. Elena and Marcus spent hours at the Hartsdale Library using the public computers because they no longer trusted any device that might be traced back to the cabin, and they were searching for any trace of Rebecca Harmon, starting with her last known address in Pennsylvania and working outward through every database they could access. When Marcus suddenly froze and turned his screen toward Elena, his face pale with shock, because he had found a faculty page for the Department of Environmental Sciences at Portland State University, and there, among the professor headshots, was a woman listed as Dr. Rachel Hartley, specializing in environmental epidemiology, and the photograph showed a woman in her early 50s with red hair now streaked with gray, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, and though she looked older and more careworn than in the photograph from 18 years ago, Elena recognized her instantly as Rebecca Harmon. They stared at the screen in stunned silence, and Marcus whispered, "She didn't disappear. She ran, and she's been hiding in plain sight under a new name." And Elena felt hope surge through her for the first time in weeks because this meant they had a witness, someone who had worked alongside her parents, who had seen the evidence firsthand, who could corroborate everything. Contacting her was delicate. They couldn't risk tipping off anyone monitoring their communications, so Marcus used his knowledge of legal research databases to find a secure email encryption service, and Elena composed a message that she agonized over for an hour, finally writing, "Dr. Hartley, my name is Elena Mitchell Carter. I am the daughter of David and Sarah Mitchell. I know who you really are, and I know what happened in 2006. I have found my parents' evidence, and I am trying to finish what they started. Please, if you're willing to talk, contact me through this encrypted email. You are not alone anymore." They sent the message and waited, and for 3 days there was no response. And Elena began to fear that Rebecca had seen the email, and decided that even after 18 years, silence was safer than truth. But on the 4th day, a response appeared. "Use this link for encrypted video call. Tonight, 9 p.m. Pacific. Come alone. Tell no one." That night, Elena sat in front of Marcus's laptop in the darkened cabin, Scholar at her feet and Marcus hovering just out of camera range, and when the video connected, she found herself looking at Rebecca Harmon's face, older and marked by years of fear and exile, and the woman's eyes filled with tears when she saw Elena. "You look so much like Sarah," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "I've thought about you every day for 18 years, wondered what happened to you, if you were safe, if you even knew who your parents were." Elena explained everything. Ashford's deathbed confession, the hidden laboratory, the evidence, the escalating harassment, and Rebecca listened with a face that grew increasingly grim. And when Elena finished, Rebecca took a deep breath and said, "I have evidence too. Evidence I took with me when I fled. I have photographs I took secretly of a meeting between Victor Crane and 3 Meridian executives with Sheriff Vickers and 2 county commissioners, taken 1 week before your parents died, where they were planning exactly how to handle the Mitchell problem. I have copies of emails I managed to download before they cut off my access, and I have my own testimony about what we discovered and what happened to Daniel." She paused, her hands shaking. "They came to my house the day after Daniel's funeral, Elena. 2 men in suits who told me very calmly that my husband's heart attack was tragic but natural, and that it would be even more tragic if I had a similar accident, or if my house burned down with me in it, and that the smart thing to do would be to leave town, change my name, and never speak about Meridian Chemical Corporation again. So I ran, and I've been running for 18 years, looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, living half a life because I was too terrified to do what your parents did." Her voice grew stronger. "But I'm done running. If you can get me federal protection, real witness protection, I will testify to everything. I will help you destroy them." The alliance formed officially the following night when they gathered around the cabin's wooden table, Ruth having driven up from her daughter's house where she was staying temporarily, Marcus with his laptop and copied files, and Rebecca Harmon connecting via encrypted video from her apartment in Portland. And together these 4 people, bound by loss and determination, began to construct a plan that would either bring justice or get them all killed. Marcus spoke first, his legal training evident in his methodical approach. We cannot go to local authorities, that much is clear. Sheriff Vickers is compromised. The county commissioners are on Meridian's payroll based on Rebecca's photographs, and we have to assume the state police have been influenced as well. We need federal intervention, and we need it to be simultaneous and overwhelming so Meridian can't use their connections to shut it down before it gains momentum. He pulled out a business card, worn and creased as if carried for years. Theodore Ashford worked on several cases with an FBI agent named James Wu, who's now the assistant director of the Philadelphia Field Office's White-Collar Crime Division. Ashford always said Wu was incorruptible, a true believer in the law. I can reach out to him, but we'll need to present a complete, irrefutable package of evidence, something so compelling he has no choice but to act immediately. Ruth spoke next, her voice steady despite the trauma of her ransacked home. I know a man named Gerald Pritchard, used to be a senior inspector for the EPA, worked out of the regional office in Pittsburgh. He was forced into early retirement 8 years ago because he kept pushing for investigation of Meridian's facility and was told by his superiors to drop it. He's been bitter about it ever since, and he's still connected to people inside the agency who share his frustration. If we can get the evidence to him, he can bypass the local EPA office and take it directly to the National Enforcement Division in Washington. Rebecca's face on the laptop screen was intense with concentration. The key is coordination. If the FBI moves before the EPA, Meridian will get a heads up and start destroying records at their facility. If the EPA moves first, Meridian will use their political connections to stall the investigation. It has to be simultaneous raids, FBI on the corporate offices, EPA on the manufacturing plant, and both agencies getting complete evidence packages at exactly the same time, so neither can be pressured to stand down. They spent the next 3 hours developing the specifics. Marcus would compile 3 identical evidence packages, each containing copies of all documents, all hard drives, all photographs, and comprehensive written statements from Elena and Rebecca detailing the conspiracy. One package would go to Agent Wu at the FBI, one to Gerald Pritchard for the EPA, and one would be held in reserve at a secure location in case the first 2 were somehow intercepted. Rebecca would prepare a detailed affidavit of her testimony and send it separately, and Ruth would use her connections in town to gather additional witness statements from families in the affected communities who had lost loved ones to cancer. Elena's role was perhaps the most dangerous. She had to stay at Whispering Creek Estate, maintaining the appearance of normal occupation, because if she fled now, Meridian would know something was happening and might accelerate their timeline. As they worked into the early morning hours, fortifying the cabin with additional locks, installing a hidden safe for the backup evidence, and establishing emergency communication protocols, they all understood that the moment they transmitted this evidence, the situation would escalate to its final, most dangerous phase, and that Meridian Chemical Corporation, facing annihilation, would have nothing left to lose. The weather forecast came through on Marcus's phone at noon, an urgent alert warning of a major winter storm system moving in from Canada, expected to drop 2 feet of snow and bring winds of 50 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions across the entire Allegheny region by nightfall, and Elena, staring at the red warning banner on the screen, felt ice water flood her veins because she understood with absolute certainty that this was it, that Meridian had been waiting for exactly this kind of cover, a natural disaster that would isolate the cabin, prevent any response from authorities, and provide the perfect explanation for why 3 people might be found frozen to death in the mountains after the storm passed. She called Marcus and Ruth immediately, told them to come to the cabin now, to bring everything they had, and by 3 in the afternoon they were there, helping her board up windows, stack furniture against the door, and set up the satellite internet system that Marcus had purchased specifically because it couldn't be cut by severing a phone line. The storm hit at 5, and within an hour the world outside had disappeared into a howling white void, the wind screaming around the cabin like a living thing, and it was in this chaos, at 7:30 when full darkness had fallen and visibility was reduced to nothing, that scholar began to growl, his body rigid, his attention fixed on the windows facing the trail. And then Elena heard it beneath the roar of the storm, the sound of engines, multiple vehicles pushing through the blizzard with the determination of people on a mission that could not be delayed. Marcus killed all the lights in the cabin, and they watched through gaps in the boarded windows as 4 black SUVs materialized out of the white darkness, parking in a semicircle around the cabin, and 10 men emerged, dressed in tactical gear, moving with military precision, and leading them, unmistakable even through the snow, was Victor Crane. No longer the polished corporate executive, but a man who had shed all pretense, his face hard and cold, as he directed his mercenaries to surround the building. Elena ran to the laptop, her hands shaking as she connected to the satellite internet, beginning the upload of every file, every photograph, every piece of evidence to Agent Wu's secure FBI server. The progress bar crawling across the screen with agonizing slowness, while outside the first of the mercenaries approached the door, and a voice amplified through the storm called out, "Miss Carter, this doesn't have to end badly. Give us the evidence, all of it, and you and your friends can walk away. You have 60 seconds to decide." Ruth had her phone out, trying to call 911, but there was no signal, the storm and the mountains conspiring to cut them off completely. And Marcus was at the window with a hunting rifle that had belonged to Elena's father, his face pale but his hands steady, and Elena watched the upload progress, 15%, 20%, while Scholar barked furiously at the door, and the 60 seconds expired, and the assault began. They came at the door with a battering ram, the heavy oak shuddering under the impact. And Marcus fired a warning shot through a gap in the boards, not trying to hit anyone but making it clear they would defend themselves, and for a moment the battering stopped. And then they heard the sound of breaking glass from the back of the cabin, multiple entry points, a coordinated breach, and Ruth grabbed a fire extinguisher as a weapon while Elena stayed at the laptop, her eyes fixed on the progress bar, 40%, 50%, the files uploading into the digital cloud where Meridian couldn't reach them, where they would exist even if everyone in this cabin died. The back door splintered, and a masked figure pushed through, and Scholar launched himself at the intruder with savage fury, a gray blur of teeth and protective rage, driving the man back, screaming. And Marcus fired again, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, and Elena saw the progress bar hit 75%, 80%. And she was crying and praying, and typing a final message to Agent Wu that said, "Under attack at Whispering Creek Estate, send help, evidence uploaded, coordinates attached." And she hit send just as the front door finally gave way, and Victor Crane stepped into the cabin, a pistol in his hand, his face twisted with fury and desperation, and the upload completed, 100%, the evidence now beyond his reach, even if he killed them all. Victor Crane stood in the doorway of the shattered cabin, his expensive suit covered in snow, his pistol raised and aimed directly at Elena, who was still sitting at the laptop, her finger hovering over the mouse. And he said in a voice that was remarkably calm given the chaos around them, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, you stupid girl. Uploading files means nothing if there's no one left to testify. No witnesses to verify authenticity, just 3 tragic victims of a winter storm, who broke into an abandoned property and froze to death when they couldn't get out, and he was moving toward her. His mercenaries pouring through both the front and back entrances now, when Scholar, who had been momentarily engaged with the man at the back door, turned and saw the threat to Elena and made a choice that was pure instinct and pure love. The dog launched himself across the cabin in a single powerful leap, 90 pounds of protective fury aimed directly at Crane, and he hit the corporate executive in the chest with enough force to knock him backward into the doorframe, his jaws seeking the arm that held the weapon, and Crane screamed and fired, the shot deafening in the enclosed space, and Scholar yelped and fell but immediately struggled back to his feet, blood staining his silver-gray coat along his shoulder, and he placed himself between Elena and Crane, still snarling despite his injury, buying her seconds that felt like hours. Marcus fired again, this time aiming not at the men but at the lanterns hanging from the ceiling, plunging the cabin into darkness and sea. House. And in that darkness, Elena heard Ruth's voice praying, heard the mercenaries shouting, heard Scholar's continued growls of defiance, and then a new sound cut through everything else. A rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the very air. The unmistakable percussion of helicopter rotors, multiple aircraft, and through the boarded windows she saw searchlights. Brilliant white beams cutting through the blizzard like swords of light, and a voice amplified to impossible volume boomed through the storm. "FBI, everyone on the ground now, drop your weapons. This property is surrounded." The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The mercenaries, who were hired guns motivated by money and not fanatic loyalty, immediately began dropping their weapons and raising their hands, understanding that whatever Meridian was paying them was not worth federal prison. And Victor Crane, still on the floor where Scholar had knocked him, looked up at the helicopter searchlights with an expression of utter disbelief as tactical teams fast roped down into the snow and stormed the cabin with professional precision. Within minutes, the cabin was flooded with FBI agents in tactical gear, and Elena found herself being pulled to safety by a calm Asian-American man in his 50s who identified himself as Assistant Director James Wu. While medics attended to Scholar's gunshot wound, and Marcus and Ruth were given shock blankets and hot coffee, and Victor Crane and his entire team of mercenaries were being zip-tied and read their rights. Wu explained that the evidence had uploaded successfully just 18 minutes ago, that Rebecca Harmon's testimony had been received simultaneously from Portland, and that the moment they had confirmed the threat to Elena's life, they had scrambled tactical teams from 3 different field offices, and even as they spoke, coordinated raids were happening across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, with FBI agents and EPA inspectors storming Meridian Chemical Corporation's headquarters in Pittsburgh, their manufacturing facility on Copper Run Creek, and the private residences of CEO Charlotte Meridian and 7 senior executives, all of them being arrested on charges that included environmental crimes, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. Elena knelt beside Scholar, who was sedated but stable, the medic assuring her the bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or vital organs, and she buried her face in his blood-matted fur and wept while outside the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the cabin, for the first time in 18 years, there was light. The unraveling of the Meridian Chemical Corporation conspiracy happened with a speed that shocked even the federal prosecutors, because Victor Crane, when faced with charges that included 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts of attempted murder, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and violations of the RICO Act that could send him to prison for the rest of his life, made the calculated decision that had defined his entire career and chose self-preservation over loyalty. And within 48 hours of his arrest, he was sitting in a conference room at the FBI's Philadelphia field office with his attorney, surrounded by agents and prosecutors, offering to testify against everyone above him in exchange for a reduced sentence. What Crane revealed was staggering in its scope and systematic evil. He named Charlotte Meridian herself, the 63-year-old CEO, who had inherited the company from her father and had known about the illegal dumping since 1996, had personally approved the decision not to repair the containment systems, and had orchestrated the cover-up that included the murders of David and Sarah Mitchell, Daniel Harmon, and the disappearance that was meant to be the murder of Rebecca Harmon. He provided emails, recorded phone conversations he had kept as insurance, and detailed accounts of meetings where corporate executives discussed eliminating problems with the casual tone of people ordering office supplies, and he implicated Sheriff Frank Vickers, County Commissioners Robert Hayes and Margaret Dutton, 3 state environmental regulators, and a network of lawyers and consultants who had helped Meridian evade oversight for nearly 2 decades. The evidence Elena's parents had compiled, combined with Rebecca Harmon's photographs and testimony, Marcus's copied files from Ashford's archive, and Crane's insider cooperation, created a prosecutorial case so overwhelming that within a week, 12 additional arrests were made, including Charlotte Meridian, who was taken from her estate in handcuffs before television cameras, her face a mask of aristocratic outrage that she could be treated like a common criminal. Rebecca Harmon flew to Philadelphia under federal protection, and when she walked into the federal courthouse to give her deposition, Elena was there to meet her, and the 2 women embraced, connected by loss and by the memory of people they had loved. And Rebecca's testimony was devastating. 4 hours of detailed recollection about the research, the discoveries, the threats, and the night Daniel died, when she had found him collapsed on their kitchen floor and had known, even as the paramedics worked on him, that this was not natural causes but murder dressed in medical language. The investigation expanded as federal agents dug deeper, discovering that Meridian's illegal dumping had been even more extensive than David and Sarah had documented, stretching back to 1995 and affecting not 3 but 7 communities in 3 states. And as this information became public, families who had buried children, spouses, parents, siblings to cancer finally had answers, finally understood that their losses were not random acts of biological misfortune but the predictable result of corporate greed and criminal negligence. A class action lawsuit was filed representing over 400 victims, and Meridian's stock price collapsed, and regulatory agencies that had somehow missed 18 years of violations suddenly found the courage to act now that the cameras were watching. and the entire rotten edifice that had seemed so powerful and untouchable just weeks before crumbled into rubble and ruin, and the promise of justice finally, belatedly, delivered. The trials began in the spring and stretched through the summer, a parade of justice that played out in federal courtrooms across Pennsylvania, and Elena attended every single day of testimony, sitting in the gallery with Ruth on one side and Rebecca Harmon on the other, watching as prosecutors methodically dismantled the conspiracy that had stolen her parents and destroyed so many lives. The evidence was presented in meticulous detail, the laboratory reports showing contamination levels that violated federal standards by factors of 10 or 20, the internal Meridian emails discussing the cost-benefit analysis of human life versus corporate profit, the photographs Rebecca had taken of Victor Crane meeting with corrupted officials, the testimony of whistleblowers who had been silenced with threats and payoffs, and most damning, Crane's own detailed account of how Charlotte Meridian had personally ordered the elimination of the Mitchell investigation, using the corporate euphemism, resolve the problem permanently, while everyone in the room understood she was ordering murder. Elena herself testified at 4 separate trials, and each time she took the stand, she carried with her a photograph of her parents holding her as an infant, and she spoke in a clear, steady voice about what had been stolen from her, about growing up in an orphanage, believing she was unwanted when the truth was that her parents had loved her so much they had died trying to make the world safer for her. And she read passages from her mother's journal, Sarah's words about fear and determination echoing through the courtroom, and more than once she saw jurors wiping tears from their eyes. The verdicts came one by one, each one a small restoration of cosmic balance. Charlotte Meridian was convicted on 18 federal counts including conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and environmental crimes, and she was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, and the judge, a stern woman in her 60s, told the defendant that she had betrayed not just the law but the fundamental social contract that says we do not poison our neighbors for profit. 4 senior Meridian executives received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Victor Crane, despite his cooperation, received 12 years, and Sheriff Frank Vickers and the 2 county commissioners were convicted of corruption and obstruction. Their sentences shorter but their reputations destroyed forever. Their positions of public trust revealed as masks for private greed. The civil settlement was historic. $400 million, the largest environmental damages award in Pennsylvania history, to be distributed among the families of cancer victims in the 7 affected communities, and Meridian Chemical Corporation, facing both this judgment and the cost of the required environmental cleanup, declared bankruptcy, and its assets were seized by the federal government and placed in a Superfund account dedicated to the decades-long process of remediating the watershed contamination, removing thousands of tons of toxic soil, dredging contaminated creek beds, and monitoring water quality for a generation. The company that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was dismantled piece by piece, its facilities closed, its brand name becoming synonymous with corporate crime, its executives led away in handcuffs, and the building that had housed its Pittsburgh headquarters was eventually sold and converted into a medical center specializing in cancer treatment, a bitter irony that felt like poetic justice. Scholar recovered from his gunshot wound, though the injury left him with a slight limp in his front left leg that was especially noticeable on cold mornings. And he wore his scar with the dignity of a soldier who had earned his rest, and Elena would often find him lying in the sun on the cabin's rebuilt porch, his graying muzzle resting on his paws, his amber eyes watching the forest with the peaceful contentment of a guardian whose watch was finally complete. Ruth became something of a local hero, featured in newspaper articles and documentary films about the case, though she consistently deflected praise, saying she had only done what Sarah Mitchell had asked her to do 18 years ago. But the truth was that her 18 years of quiet faithfulness, feeding Scholar and maintaining the property and keeping the memory alive, had made everything else possible, and the families of the cancer victims knew this and honored her for it. Rebecca Harmon, released from 18 years of exile and fear, began the slow process of reclaiming her identity, legally changing her name back from Rachel Hartley, returning to Pennsylvania for the first time since she had fled, visiting Daniel's grave and finally allowing herself to grieve properly. And she told Elena that testifying had been terrifying but also liberating, that speaking the truth after so many years of silence had felt like setting down a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. For Elena, The trials were both exhausting and cathartic, each verdict a validation that her parents had been right, that their fight had been worth it, that their deaths, while tragic and unjust, had not been meaningless. And when the final trial concluded and Charlotte Meridian was led away to begin her sentence, Elena stood on the courthouse steps with Ruth and Rebecca and Marcus, who had become her family by choice, if not by blood, and she felt something she had not felt since she was 6 months old. She felt like she belonged to something larger than herself, like she was part of a story that mattered, like the orphan girl from Street. Catherine's had finally found her purpose. 6 months after the final trial, Elena stood on the newly constructed deck of what had once been her family's isolated cabin, but was now the central hub of the Mitchell-Harmon Environmental Research Center, watching as the first cohort of graduate students arrived, their vehicles navigating the trail that had been cleared and graded and transformed from an obstacle course into a proper road. And she felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the pain and loss and struggle had been leading to this moment when Whispering Creek Estate would finally fulfill the purpose her parents had envisioned for it. The transformation had been remarkable and swift, funded by Elena's portion of the settlement, $3 million that she had immediately dedicated to creating something that would outlive all of them and serve the cause her parents had died defending. The original cabin had been carefully preserved and expanded, its logs restored and its stone hearth maintained as the heart of the building. But surrounding it now were new structures built in sympathetic architectural style, 2 dormitory buildings that could house 20 students, a modern laboratory facility equipped with the latest water testing and analysis equipment, a library and classroom building, and scattered throughout the 200 acres, a network of trails and monitoring stations where students would learn to do the patient, methodical work of environmental science. Marcus Chen had surprised everyone, including himself, by leaving the legal profession entirely and accepting Elena's offer to serve as the center's executive director, and he had thrown himself into the work with the passion of someone who had finally found his calling, managing budgets and recruiting students and handling the endless administrative details that allowed the researchers to focus on their science. And he told Elena that after years of pushing paper in service of other people's interests, it felt revolutionary to be building something that mattered, something good. Ruth had moved into a small cottage on the eastern edge of the property, a charming structure with a porch that overlooked the creek, and her official title was Grandmother in Residence, a position Elena had created specifically for her that involved no specific duties beyond being present, being herself, offering wisdom and comfort, and the kind of unconditional love that only someone who had waited 18 years to keep a promise understood how to give, and the students adored her, seeking her out for advice on everything from homesickness to career choices. And she baked cookies and told stories about Sarah Mitchell and kept the memory of the people who had started this fight alive for a new generation. Rebecca Harmon had been the hardest to convince, her 18 years of exile having left her cautious and reluctant to put down roots. But when Elena offered her the position of lead researcher and senior faculty, with the promise that she would finally be able to continue the work she and Daniel had begun, Rebecca had wept and accepted, and she had sold her house in Oregon and returned to Pennsylvania, and though she still had nightmares sometimes, still looked over her shoulder more than necessary. She told Elena that being here, working with students who were passionate about environmental justice, felt like Daniel's death and the Mitchells' deaths had not been in vain, that the work was continuing, and that was the only memorial that mattered. Scholar, now 10 years old and moving with the careful deliberation of dignified age, his coat more silver than black now, his limp more pronounced but his spirit undimmed, had become the center's unofficial mascot and most beloved resident, and the students competed for the honor of walking him around the property, and he attended lectures lying at the front of the classroom, his presence a reminder that loyalty and courage came in many forms, and when he passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, they buried him on the hill overlooking the cabin with a stone marker that read, "Scholar, Guardian and Friend, who waited and who saved us all." Elena herself had changed in ways both visible and invisible. She had grown from the frightened 18-year-old orphan who had arrived at Whispering Creek with nothing but questions into a confident young woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. And she enrolled in an environmental science program herself, studying alongside the graduate students, learning the technical skills her parents had mastered. And she understood now that her inheritance was not just land or evidence or even justice, but something deeper and more enduring, the courage to stand against injustice even when the cost was high. The determination to speak truth, even when silence was safer, and the bone-deep conviction that one person, armed with evidence and integrity, could change the world. On the day the center officially opened, with a ceremony attended by EPA officials and cancer survivors and families of the victims and reporters who documented this transformation of tragedy into hope, Elena gave a speech, and she spoke about her parents not as martyrs or saints, but as ordinary people who had made an extraordinary choice. And she said that the best way to honor them was not to build monuments, but to continue their work, to train a new generation of scientists who would refuse to stay silent when they witnessed crimes against the environment and against the people who depended on it. And as she spoke, she looked out at the faces of the students who had come here to learn, at Ruth and Rebecca and Marcus who had become her family, at the mountains that held this valley in their ancient embrace. And she felt her mother's presence as surely as if Sarah Mitchell were standing beside her, felt her father's pride, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was finally, truly, home.